It's taken me a little while to do a post-fight analysis video of one of the undercard fights from the Gennady Golovkin bill on the weekend. That fight specifically being Ola Afolabi versus Lukasz Janik. I did my video on the Mike Perez fight and on the Gennady Golovkin fight quite quickly afterwards, but this one it took me a bit of time to come up with this, and the main reason behind that is because I wanted to watch the fight back on numerous occasions. I've watched it twice with the commentary on and once with the commentary off. It's one that I found particularly frustrating and difficult, so I just wanted to put down a few thoughts on it. Perhaps controversially, I actually scored the fight in favour of Lukasz Janik. On my scorecard, I had it 115 to 113 in favour of Lukasz Janik, and the reason I found that a particularly frustrating result is I thought that Ola Afolabi looked the better fighter. Nevertheless, I scored it in favour of Lukasz Janik, which I'll come on to in a minute. But first, a bit of background. Ola Afolabi, obviously the much sort of better known, even though he's had less fights, possibly the more experienced guy in terms of the number of rounds and the quality of opposition he's been in with. He's had 27 fights, 20 wins, 3 losses, 4 draws. Obviously, been in with the likes of Marco Huck, Enzo Maccarinelli, numerous sort of top level guys. Whereas Lukasz Janik has had 28 fights, 26 wins, 2 losses, including this one with Ola Afolabi. His only previous loss came to Matthias Masterneck, who was the previous European cruiserweight champion. He lost that on the Klitschko-Povetkin undercard, and Janik was actually stopped by Masterneck in a 5th round knockout. That was the only time he's been stopped. Ola Afolabi has never been stopped as a matter of interest. But just sort of briefly on the fight, I mean, Ola Afolabi at times looked to be like the boss in the ring. He looked to be the classier guy. His work was of a higher quality. Technically, he was better. His jab was good. He worked good angles. Had better sort of head movement and body movement. He took quite a few clean shots from Lukasz Janik. I think very few shots got through, especially to the head area. At the end of the fight, Afolabi didn't have a mark on him, whereas Lukasz Janik was pretty bust up. He's busted nose, quite a bad cut over one eye, another cut as well. He looked like he'd been through an absolute war, whereas Ola Afolabi still looked relatively fresh. Afolabi, as I say, he looked technically the better fighter. He looked like he had more power and could land the heavier shots. He looked like he took a lower percentage of his opponent's shots. He never looked troubled by his opponent. Yeah, Afolabi's obviously got a good chin. He's never been stopped, and he was never wobbled at any point throughout the fight. And all of that would lead you to think that he'd won this fight quite easily. However, on scoring it on numerous occasions, I have Lukasz Janik winning. And just with regard to the judges, one of them scored it a draw, 114-114, which does indicate that it was certainly a close fight. 2 had it in favour of Afolabi. 1 scored it 117-111, which I simply cannot understand, for me, a margin that wide. 1 scored it 115-113. And whilst I disagree with that, I can see how you could come up with the score as a draw or Afolabi by 1 or 2, just on the basis that at times it was quite a scrappy fight. There were some rounds that were quite quiet and very tight, and I can see that there would be some discrepancies on the scorecards. I don't think it's going to be one of those fights where everyone watches it and comes up with the same results. I think, put simply, this is one of those fights on judging it. It depends what you prefer. Afolabi looked technically the better fighter, looked heavier, looked more likely to score a stoppage. Whereas Lukasz Janik looked the busier fighter. He came forward more, he sort of threw more shots, threw more combinations. he was a busier fighter, landing flurries, albeit crude flurries at time. Going through how I actually scored this fight, I gave the first 3 rounds to Lukasz Janik. The third one, I do recognise you can make an argument for Afolabi winning that. I think the third one was a close round. The first 2 I gave to Janik. I thought the second round was a particularly clear Janik round. The first one I sort of narrowly gave to Janik. The third one very slightly gave to Janik. But just briefly, if we treat those rounds as a group, the reason I scored those 3 rounds to Janik was simply work rate and sort of activity. Really, he was the one coming forward. He was throwing more. He was offering more action. I thought Afolabi sort of really decent jab. He was working well off the jab, not throwing a huge amount of lever, not throwing a huge amount of combinations, but he got that jab pumping from the start, and he was looking quite technically good on that level. He looked the classier fighter in my opinion from round 1. I've made a note here that says, Lukasz very, very busy, admittedly not too much of substance. But I felt at the end of the first round, I just couldn't give it to Afolabi, because whilst he looked slightly classier, he really didn't offer very much, whereas Lukasz Janik was throwing, he was pressing the action, he was more active. Your second round again, completely outworking Afolabi. Don't get me wrong, I thought he was slightly crude. I didn't think he looked like a technically top level or brilliant fighter. Nevertheless, I scored the second and third rounds in his favour just because he was pressing the action and it looked like he was offering a lot more. I think fourth round onwards, Afolabi really started coming into the fight, to be honest. His class started to tell. He had quite a quiet start, as I've mentioned, and he started to wake up a bit from the fourth round. In fact, I would go as far as to say I've scored Afolabi 10-9 rounds, 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th. He started to throw a bit more, he started to land more regularly, he produced much cleaner work. He was mixing it up, his jab was still there, landing well. He seemed to be throwing some really effective body punches that looked fairly, visually impressive. And he started to boss it a bit. There were certain points where he was coming forward. Janik stopped his relentless flurries, and Afolabi seemed to be the one bossing the action and going forward. And he at this point, I think the phrase ring general would certainly apply to Afolabi if it had to apply to one of the 2 between these rounds. And to be honest with you, I gave 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th to Afolabi. Going into the 6th and 7th, I thought that was fight over. I thought most likely Afolabi would score a stoppage. If not, I really didn't see how Janik was going to work his way into the fight. It seemed that he'd started well. He'd started busy, but Afolabi's class was beginning to tell, and the fight was going to be over at that point. I thought I didn't see Janik taking rounds again at that point. I didn't see him working his way back in, and quite frankly, I saw Afolabi stopping him. There were times. In the 5th round, Janik, I think he took a bust nose. 6th round, he seemed to take a cut to the eye, which started to bleed quite profusely. 7th round, Ola was really sort of walking him down, I think the commentators used to phrase bullying, and he really was sort of controlling the fight, sort of marching him down, battering him around the ring, following him around, and I really thought it was going to be a long night, long 5 rounds for Janik after that. So, as I say, after 7 rounds, I've given first 3 to Janik, next 4 to Afolabi. So I have Afolabi 4-3 up, but the momentum with Afolabi, and certainly Janik looking like the more beaten up man, if you like. He looked like he'd been in a fight at that stage. 8th and 9th were very, very frustrating rounds. I scored both to Janik, which was quite surprising. Afolabi really seemed to take his foot off the gas, to be honest. The second he stopped pressing the action, and I don't know whether he decided to take a rest for a round or what his thought process was, but the second he started to lower his work rate, Janik returned to the fighter he was in the first 3 rounds. He started coming forward again, pressing the action. He's throwing an awful lot of shots at this point. Janik's throwing a lot of lever. Huge flurries, constant action. To be honest with you, Afolabi looked like he wasn't taking multiple clean shots. I don't want to give that impression, but Janik was throwing a lot. He was catching Afolabi. Some of them were sort of scuffing shots. It certainly never looked like Afolabi was in any trouble. He was never rocked. His chin held up very well. But he just wasn't busy at all in the 8th and 9th. He took his foot off the gas completely, and I really think he gifted those 2 rounds to Lukasz Janik. If he put his foot on the pedal a bit and kept the momentum going, that would have been fight over. He'd have won the majority of the rounds by the end of the 9th. Janik would have probably given up, but he really let Janik back into the fight 8th and 9th, and whether his corner told him that or not, I don't know, but he came out firing in the 10th. He landed a few big shots. Afolabi, to be honest, was landing more singles himself. Afolabi, he didn't so much, sort of brilliant combinations during the fight, but he landed a few quite big punches in the 10th. He rocked Janik, and again at this point I thought he was going to punish Janik. I thought, that's it, Janik's had his spell. Afolabi's going to get the 10th, 11th and 12th and win a big, a close but deserved decision victory. And he was rocking Janik. Again, even going into the 10th, I thought it was a reasonable chance of getting the stoppages, because Janik was looking pretty beaten up, and every time Afolabi, put the pedal to the metal, he seemed to be, clearly the better fighter. But once again, 11th and 12th rounds I've scored to Janik. So just to reiterate, I've given the first 3 to Janik, I've given the 8th and the 9th to Janik, and I've given the 11th and 12th to Janik. So in total I gave him 7 rounds. Obviously that leaves Afolabi with 5. Admittedly, the 3rd round you could have given to Afolabi. That was a close one. But I really, as I say, I've scored it 7-5 to Janik. I couldn't see how you'd give it 6-all. I know it was a sort of close fight and a lot of the rounds were scrappy, so it depends which style you prefer. So I can't accept one judge scoring it 1-1-5, 1-1-3, but how on earth one scored it 1-1-7, 1-11, I just don't know. Janik was so much busier for large portions of the fight. Afolabi barely threw, a collection of punches in the first 2 rounds, and in the last 2 rounds he was backed up against the ropes. Janik was throwing combinations left, right and centre. He was the much busier man, and this is why I found the fight so frustrating, because I thought Afolabi looked an absolute class above. At times he showed really decent technical ability. He looked like he had quite a lot of power. He looked like he had Janik in all sorts of trouble. He was very dominant, but he never closed. He never looked like, he rocked Janik and he looked like he could knock him out, but he never seemed to actually move to do it. There was no point, I got the impression, Afolabi's going for the knockout here, and that really frustrated me. Even the rounds he was, winning dominantly, and he never seemed to sort of turn up the pace and try and score for the knockout. There was a real lack of killer instinct in my opinion, and whether Afolabi was just very confident that he was winning or not, I don't know, but certainly periods of the fight, as I say, he started slowly, and 11th and 12th round he certainly seemed to take his foot off the pedal, and it's just frustrating. He let Janik back into a fight that was a lot closer than it needed to be. I mean, as I say, I've scored the fight in Janik's favour, but Afolabi looked like he could have won every round if he tried. From the very first round, he looked like the classier man. He was just not throwing enough, not busy enough, and he was allowing Janik to sort of press the action for a lot of the fight. So, as I say, I've scored the fight 1-1-5, 1-1-3. I've got no complaints with the draw. Whilst I disagree, I can see an argument with the 1-1-5, 1-1-3. The 1-1-7, 1-11 card I do strongly disagree with. I just don't think it puts enough credit behind the busyness and intensity of Lukasz Janik. I mean, in terms of a few bullet points I've jotted down about Afolabi, I think he's got a lot of things going for him. He's got a good jab. He's never been stopped. He's obviously got a good chin. He's got a very tight defence. He's got good head movement, good sort of shoulder roll, and that sort of thing. I think what I'd like to see more from him is greater emphasis on combinations rather than just throwing single shots, and really more of a sort of fighting spirit, killer instinct, more of a sort of press the action. I mean, Afolabi's clearly a man with big power. He's scored some devastating knockouts, but the fact remains that he's been in, he stepped into the ring professionally 27 times and only scored 9 knockouts. Like, that means that 2 out of every 3 times Afolabi fights, he doesn't score a knockout, and that's not necessarily common for a a cruiserweight fighter at the top level. So I think he really needs to try and develop that killer instinct, try and turn up the pace a bit, and try and get guys out of there when he's dominating them. And I think he's got a good basis, good chin, good jab, technically good, strong defence, doesn't take a lot, but he really has got to turn up the pace a bit. And fights like this where he's clearly the better fighter, he's got to make sure that he's winning, because had the decision gone the other way, which I think it very, very easily could have done, it would have been absolutely devastating for him. And you got to think that it's going to be very, very tough for him to come back after that, to be honest with you. So he's got a good basis, but there's a lot to improve upon. How he compares to other people in the division, I mean, he's done a good showing against Marco Huck, but once again, 3 fights he didn't win. There's a lot of an argument to say he should have scored a knockout. He had Huck in trouble a lot of times, especially in the first fight, and he didn't go on and do it. And I think that's pretty telling. Whether he'll get the call for the Nathan Cleverly fight at some time in 2014, I mean, that seems like a possible fight, obviously, with both guys being Brits. With Cleverly wanting to move up the rankings, Afolabi's very highly rated, so a win over him would look good. And to be honest with you, I see Cleverly winning that fight easily. I mean, Cleverly's a busy fighter, great hand speed, fights in flurries. He'd be as busy as Lukasz Janik, and the only thing is he'd have a lot more class than Lukasz Janik, so he'd take that away from Afolabi. And if Afolabi fought the way he fought against Lukasz Janik, I think Cleverly would win quite convincingly. I don't think Cleverly would knock him out, because I don't think Cleverly's the hardest puncher in the game, and Afolabi's got great defence and a great chin. But I could see Cleverly going out and winning every round of that fight. I really could. Afolabi against the other top level opposition, it's going to be hard for him to get another fight with Huck, having fought him 3 times already and failed to win on every occasion. I know the cruiserweight division is somewhat open, with some controversy about Guillermo Jones, etc. After the Denis Lebedev fight, but we'll see. I don't know where he goes from here, really. He's one of those difficult fighters where he's probably unfashionable and people don't want to fight him because the risk-reward ratio just isn't there. He's not a huge draw, so he doesn't add much to a fight. He's a dangerous, awkward opponent to fight. And if you lose to him, it's going to cause you a lot of problems and be a big blip in your record. So I think the Nathan Cleverly fight is quite likely off the back of that. I think it's a winnable fight for Cleverly that would allow him to move up the rankings quite nicely and move into title contention. So I think that's likely where Afolabi goes. He really needs to work on his killer instinct and needs to be a bit busier, because it's very frustrating for me to score a fight for an opponent who I think was clearly the inferior guy, had much less class, and he looked like he was not being able to answer some of the questions posed to him, but he was just so much busier and pressed the fight so much more. I found myself having to give it to him, which was very frustrating. Just touching briefly on Lukasz Janik, where he goes from here, it's going to be difficult for him, really. 2 times he stepped up in class, Matthias Masterdeck and Ola Afolabi. Both times he's lost. Masterdeck stopped him, Afolabi won on points. I think it's difficult, really. Afolabi's decent, Masterdeck's decent, but neither of them are real top level in my opinion. So despite his record being decent, 26 wins, 14 knockouts, only 2 losses, it's going to be hard for him. And he's one of these fighters, he's quite awkward, he's quite busy, but he doesn't seem to carry massive punching power. He doesn't, he's very crude, rugged type fighter, and I think he's going to struggle if, moving, any time he steps up in class against someone who's technically sound. So, frustrating fight. As I say, I gave it to Lukasz Janik. I felt a bit sorry for him, really, because I gave him the fight, and whilst he looked bust up at the end of the fight and he looked like he'd been through a real war, while Afolabi was, much cooler, I thought there should have been a higher emphasis on the work rate and the way he pressed the action. I think Afolabi landing a few technically sound jabs is great, but at the end of the day, in the first 3 rounds, all Afolabi did was sparingly throw the jab every so often, whereas Janik was swarming all over him. And whilst Afolabi looked, technically sound, it just wasn't enough for me. So I think I think it was a bit of a robbery, really. I don't think it was a convincing victory by Janik, but I think scores really didn't do the fight justice, so I was disappointed in that. But that's my analysis anyway. Clearly, that is not in agreement with any of the three judges. It was in disagreement with the Sky commentators and with a few other YouTube pundits. I don't know if that's the right word, but a few other people who make these kind of videos on YouTube, who all seem to score the fight to Afolabi. So I'd be keen to hear people's views, whether or not I'm barking up the wrong tree there, and which round you gave to which fighter. I mean, one of the things that frustrated me about the Sky commentary is, I think it was Matthew Macklin commentating, and he was saying at the end of the fight, he'd given the fight to Afolabi for the cleaner work. But 11th and 12th round, both commentators made reference to the fact that they'd given the rounds to Janik because he was busier. 8th and 9th rounds, they both were saying that, Ola had let Janik into the fight, and Janik was maybe sneaking those rounds. I think in the 6th and 7th they were giving Afolabi a warning, like, be careful, because whilst you're looking class, you're letting this guy back into the fight. And I think they even made reference in the first couple of rounds that they were having to give it to Janik just for being busier. So at the end they were both saying they'd given the fight to Afolabi based on the fact he was producing a classier work. But that's not how we score fights. We score fights based on typically a 10-9 system on each round, and a fighter can look dominant for 5 rounds out of 12, but if another guy narrowly wins 7 rounds, then he wins the fight. That's how we score fights in boxing. And they didn't show a scorecard during the fight, the commentators, but they made reference to giving multiple rounds to Janik during the course of the fight, and then at the end both said that they thought Afolabi had won with a bit in hand due to his class. So I thought that was frustrating. I'd have preferred it if they produced a scorecard during the fight, and we'd been able to monitor it as we went along, because I was noting it down, and as I say, I think Janik won 7 of the 12 rounds, and whilst Afolabi looked dominant in his five rounds that he won, whereas Janik more narrowly won, that's how we score fights. And the fact Afolabi looked classier and really bullied for times of the fight is irrelevant in terms of scoring it. So that's how I gave it. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts. Just to clarify, I do believe Afolabi's the better fighter. If they fought again, I'd be on Afolabi's side. I think Afolabi's got more potential, but frustratingly, I scored the fight to Lukasz Janik. Anyway, I've gone on for long enough now. I'd be really keen to hear people's thoughts on my analysis. Any feedback on my scoring would be of interest. Be really interested to see how you scored the fight, what your thoughts were, and if you've got any thoughts on where either of these guys go next. Also, how Afolabi versus Cleverly sounds for next year, both how realistic that is and who you would have in that fight. Over and out.